Hello and welcome to my video on how to knit the I-cord. The I-cord is basically a knitted, quite stretchy rope of very narrow diameter. Technically it is a very narrow tube of stockinette stitch. Normally when you're knitting a tube, you use circular needles or 4 or 5 double pointed needles, but in this case, because it's such a small diameter with so few stitches, you need to just use 2 double pointed needles instead. You can also use 2 straight needles, which I'll be showing you how to use later on in the video. In this part of the video, I'll be showing you how you use 2 double pointed needles to make an I-cord. The very first thing you need to do is tie a slip knot and tighten that slip knot onto one of your needles. You'll then need to use whichever cast on method you wish to cast on your stitches. Normally, I-cord consists of 3 or 4 stitches and hardly ever more than 6. Instead of just knitting straight away from that needle like you would on straight needles, you first need to slide those stitches to the other end of the needle. This will result in the tail end of the yarn and the working yarn being towards the bottom of the needle instead of towards the top like usual. As ever, ignore the tail end of the yarn and only work with the working yarn attached to your ball of yarn. The first thing you need to do is knit 1 row, so that's 4 knit stitches in this case. Once you have completed that first row of knit stitches, you'll need to swap the needles between your hands and slide the stitches once more to the other end of the needle. You will then repeat that same process again and again. So you knit 4 knit stitches, and then you slide the stitches to the other end of the needle, and you just repeat these 2 steps over and over. It is the sliding of the stitches which means that you are actually circular knitting. Even though you're only using 2 double pointed needles, this is circular knitting. It is the fact that the working yarn comes from the bottom stitch on the left hand needle and forms each first stitch on the right hand needle that creates the circular knitting, because it forces the knitting to wrap around into a tube shape. Therefore, please bear in mind that the first knit stitch of each row must not be too loose. If it is too loose, it will mean that there will be a gap between the last stitch of the previous row and the first stitch of the next row. This gap will mean that the tube shape will not be effectively formed. So just make sure, as you're doing it, that the first stitch you make on each knit row is not too loose. If you want to see how far you've got with your I-cord and check your progress, just pull on the tail end of the yarn attached to the end of the I-cord. This will show you how far you have come and how much I-cord you have already made. Pulling on the yarn tail also helps to form the tube shape of the I-cord, and so it's useful to do every few rows anyway. And here is my I-cord after several more rows. So you can see it's quite stretchy. I'm now going to show you how to bind off and therefore finish your I-cord. Before I do that, I'm going to do one more row of knit stitch. And once I've finished that row, I'm going to slide the stitches one last time to the other end of the needle. I am then going to use the basic knit bind off method, but you can use whichever method you prefer. So to begin, I've done 2 knit stitches. The idea then is to take the lower of those 2 stitches and bring it up over the stitch above it and over the needle tip. If you'd like to see how this is done, please see my other video on the basic knit bind off. So I knit the next stitch and do exactly the same thing for each stitch on the left hand needle until the left hand needle is free. I will eventually be left with just one single stitch on my right hand needle. You then need to cut off the excess yarn to leave you about 6 inches of tail on the end. You then feed this yarn tail through the remaining stitch on your needle, and then you tighten that knot. You'll then be left with an I-cord with a tail at each end. Obviously you don't want to leave it like this, so what you do is you take each tail and you thread it onto a tapestry needle or yarn needle, basically a needle with a large enough eye for the yarn to go through. You then feed each tail, or rather each needle, through the centre of the I-cord. You take it about 2 inches through the I-cord, maybe 1.5 inches, 2 inches through the I-cord, and then take it out through the side of the I-cord and pull tight so the I-cord scrunches up. You then cut off the excess yarn and then stretch the I-cord out, and the end of that yarn tail should disappear within the I-cord, leaving each tail running through the I-cord hidden for about 1.5 or 2 inches. So, what can you actually use I-cord for? Well, it actually has many uses and you can get really creative with it. You can use it for drawstrings or straps. You can add it as a border to blankets and other projects. You can sew I-cord into different shapes such as flowers to use as embellishments. I've personally used it on a stuffed bird toy, a knitted bird toy, as the bird's legs. I think my favourite thing to do with I-cord though is to actually knit with it, so use the I-cord as a really chunky yarn. So you just use it with large diameter needles and you get a really chunky knit effect. And now I'm going to show you how to use 2 straight needles instead of 2 double pointed needles to make an I-cord. This is useful if you don't actually have double pointed needles. First thing you need to do is cast on. You can use your favourite method and just cast on the number of stitches you require for your I-cord. In this case I'm going to use the long tail cast on technique and cast on 4 stitches. In the double pointed needle method, at this point you would slide the stitches to the other end of the needle. But because there is a stopper on straight needles, you can't do this. Instead, you need to slide all the stitches onto the other needle. Now, if you just slide them straight over, you're going to risk dropping a stitch. So what you're going to do is you're going to slip each stitch individually, purlwise. Now if you don't know how to slip a stitch purlwise, what you do is you simply go into each stitch with your right hand needle as if you're going to purl that stitch, but instead of doing any of the purl stitch, you simply slip that stitch straight onto the right hand needle without doing anything else. It's very easy. And you just do this with every single stitch on the needle. So you go down through each stitch and simply slip it off the end of the needle onto your right hand needle. You will notice at this point that the tail end of your yarn and the working yarn now come from the lower stitch on your left hand needle, rather than the upper stitch, like it normally would when you're knitting. Now you need to knit all of those stitches, so that's knit 4 stitches. This is just a normal method of doing knit stitch, nothing special. Once you have completed your row of knit stitches, you need to repeat the first step, which was to slip all the stitches purlwise onto your other needle. And then you simply repeat these 2 steps again and again until you have the length of I-cord you require. So step 1 is slipping all the stitches purlwise onto your other needle, and step 2 is doing knit stitch across the whole row. One little tip is to make sure that the first knit stitch on each row is not too loose. Because you are circular knitting, even though it doesn't look like you're circular knitting, you are in fact circular knitting. You need to make sure that that first stitch is not too loose, because you want the knitting to wrap up into a tube. If it's too loose, it won't wrap up effectively. As you go along and you knit more rows, gently pull on the tail of yarn, which is at the end of your I-cord. This will just allow you to check more accurately on your progress as you go along. After several rows of knitting, your I-cord will look a bit like this. And now I'm going to show you how to bind off and therefore finish your I-cord. To do this, you first need to slip all of the stitches purlwise. And then I'm going to use the basic knit bind off method, but you can use whichever bind off method you prefer. To do this, I'm going to knit 2 stitches to start. And then I'm going to take the lower of those stitches over the top of the stitch above it and over the needle tip to leave me with 1 stitch on the right hand needle. I'll then knit another stitch and do exactly the same thing again. I'll repeat this until I have no stitches left on the left hand needle and only 1 on the right hand needle. Now you need to snip off the excess working yarn to leave you with about 6 inches of yarn tail. You then take this tail and you feed it through the last remaining stitch that was on your right hand needle, and then you pull it tight. That will leave you with an I-cord with a yarn tail at either end. To finish off your I-cord completely, you'll need to weave in each of these tails through the centre of your I-cord. To do this, feed each tail onto a yarn needle or tapestry needle, feed it through the centre of the I-cord for 1.5 to 2 inches, then out the side of the I-cord, snip off the excess of the yarn, and stretch your I-cord out to make the tail disappear within the I-cord, so that it lies down the centre. Thank you very much for watching.